Hi, I'm Anya McDowell. I'm here with Tina Kover, who translated Older Brother by Mahir Guven. So my first question is, in fact, what is your translation process like?
So for me, it's pretty straightforward. I prefer not to read the book before I start translating. So what I like to do is literally just open at page 1 and start. And then I go through the whole book one time. I try to get it right or as close to perfect as I can the first time. I don't like to go back over and over a draft, and I think you can end up, or I can end up, overthinking things that way and overworking a phrase. And then you end up with language that sounds a bit stilted, it can sound overworked. So I go through the book one time, then I go back over it again, just briefly, checking for mistakes, typos, things that need to be kind of standardized throughout the text that I didn't figure out early on and figured out later. So just make sure everything flows and everything matches, and then that's about it, really.
Great. When we talked earlier, I said I do that too. I don't read before. I think it keeps the freshness alive, right? Exactly. It allows you to be surprised by the text.
That's exactly it. I mean, as a translator, you're a reader of the text. You're a close reader, and you're probably the closest reader that anyone could be. And so I think when you are surprised or emotionally affected by something that happens in the story, right when it comes time to translate it, your feelings come through more effectively. And it has more of an emotional impact on your readers then.
Agreed. So then, specifically about Older Brother, what were some of the challenges? Because it's not it's a slightly unusual book in its form. It's almost like this stream of consciousness, if you will, from the first person from the author, and there's a lot of slang. It's very specific and I'd love to hear more about how you approached it and what the challenges were.
Well, it was very challenging, extremely challenging. I'll say that because, as you know, the book is absolutely loaded from cover to cover with slang, and it's a very particular kind of slang. It's sort of Parisian banlieue slang, urban slang, and it has a sort of Franco-Arabic quality as well, because a lot of the people that we meet in the book are either Middle Eastern born, or they've grown up in Paris but with Arabic speaking parents. So it was a lot to get through in terms of making it sound natural. I think for me that was the biggest challenge, and the thing that I worked hardest on was to make it sound like I was channeling the language rather than sort of imitating what I think an urban dweller, a young urbanite, would sound like. I think there was always that danger of tipping over a little bit into caricature, and I was very, very anxious to avoid that. So the story itself, I think, is incredibly gripping, and it rolls along, so I certainly didn't have any trouble getting creatively hooked into the plot. And I really, since I hadn't read it before, was really anxious to see what was going to come next, and anxious to see how the various plot lines were going to resolve. I was loving it as I was translating it. But getting the language right was by far the biggest challenge. I would say that was probably the biggest challenge of my translation career so far.
Wow. Were you able to get it right on the first time, or did this take some more tinkering than usual?
I think I did get it right the first time, but the first time took a while. the first time was pretty time consuming because I did actually a lot of lurking on forums, like message boards, just about things like French rap. And I just wanted to get a feel for the way people were speaking when they weren't writing for public consumption. They were just talking to each other. So I kind of let myself soak a little bit in that language before I really tackled the book. And it often took a lot of research as I was translating on these forums. And like, there's a really good urban dictionary that I used. I definitely had to break off a lot and go look things up and make sure I was getting them right.
Yeah. Is it different translating a female voice versus a male voice? And by that I mean, not all books have that feeling, but some do. And so I'm just curious if there's a different approach or it feels different for you.
Not a different approach exactly. I mean, I always try to channel the author's voice as closely as I can. But it definitely, I would say, is more of a deliberate choice to speak in a masculine way, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I can certainly,
It does, yeah.
It's less natural, but at least to start out. But then once I get into the flow, once you can hear a character's voice, and the thing that helps the most is if the character is vividly drawn, is well drawn. If they are,
Of course,
you'll have a much easier time, getting yourself into the right headspace. And then once you're in it,
mm-hmm.
once you're in the flow, I find that you can channel pretty much any voice effectively.
Yeah. Speaking of just literary translation in general, what do you think what are some of the things that make a really good translation? And do you think that you should aim to capture or recreate the text to the letter, or are you trying to create something that sort of lives on its own, but then obviously is in the same vein? How much latitude do you think you have as a translator, and what do you think is the golden sort of ratio for you?
I certainly think it's a mistake to try to translate any text letter for letter, word for word. I mean, I think being too rigid can be disastrous in terms of what you end up with. I think the most important thing is to translate the larger meaning of a word, of a phrase, of a paragraph. Obviously, accuracy is important, particularly when you're translating from one language to another. You still want to stay as much within the source culture as possible, because that's a lot of why we read translation. Yeah. It's not to read something that's 100% ordinary. It's about not only the similarity between all of us that we get in literary expression, but it's about difference as well. And if you're reading a book set in Paris or set in Rome or set in Shanghai, you're partly reading that to get a sense of what it's like to live in Paris or Rome or Shanghai, and what the mindset is there. So I think it's important to stay true, very true to the original text, but that doesn't mean linguistically, it doesn't mean bending over backward to exactly reproduce the linguistic aspect of the text. It's the essence that's important. It's the soul of the book. I think if you do that correctly, it can absolutely stand on its own, the translation versus the source text, but they should always be deeply connected. I mean, the the way I always think of it is like they're fraternal twins. You know,
that's a very good analogy.
Yeah, I mean, there's the resemblance, the duplication is extremely important.
We did a translation panel at the Miami Book Fair a couple years ago, and I remember you said something that really stuck with me, that nothing is lost in translation, and you were so emphatic, and I loved it, and I agreed, especially if it's a good translation, because a bad translation could completely butcher.
Oh yeah, that's the caveat.
Yeah.
Nothing is
that is
good translation.
Exactly. But I'd love to, I always wanted to ask you to expand on that. So that's me doing so right now.
Oh. Well, it goes back to what I was just saying. I mean, I think, you know, if you translate effectively, for example, even with a joke, jokes, things like humor, I think are notoriously difficult to translate. You know, that's where you can't literally translate just word for word, because generally jokes and puns and folk sayings, you know, they don't make any sense if you simply translate them word for word. But it's about the essence, and if you can translate, you know, the essence of a humorous remark, whether or not you've used similar nouns and verbs becomes meaningless. If the person chuckles at your translation, then you've done your job. So I think nothing is ever lost. I think, if anything, words and literature are like matter. You know, they can't be destroyed. They can only be transmuted. And so I think a good translation is just a transmutation. You know, it's the same book, just in a slightly different form. So nothing is lost. It's just changed.
It's like an alternate universe.
Yeah.
Where it's almost the same, but its own thing.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Can translation be taught?
That's a difficult question. I was not taught myself. I never studied translation. I never had any sort of formal, I studied French, but I didn't have any formal training in translation itself. And certainly I never studied translation theory. I know a lot of translators have degrees in translation, or they've pursued some course of study in it. And I think some people do feel that it's important to understand theory. And I think in general, it's always helpful to understand why you're doing what you're doing. I wouldn't argue with that. But for me, anyway, translation is a very visceral process. You know, it's something that comes from deep inside you, and it's also a talent like anything else. Most talents can't be completely taught. You have to have that germ within you to begin with, and training and study can certainly help that flourish. I would also say that you can do things to make yourself a better translator. You can read. I think the most important thing, if anybody were to ask me what's the most important thing I can do to be a better translator, is read, because I think the better of a reader you are, the better of a translator you'll be. The more richness and diversity of language you can soak up and immerse yourself in, the more words that become part of your vocabulary, the more ways of expressing any given feeling or thought. The more of those you have at your disposal, the more weapons you have in your arsenal to deploy on the page when you're translating. And so I think things like that are very important.
What are you working on right now?
So right now I am working on a nonfiction volume which will be called in English, The Science of J.R.R. Tolkien. It's absolutely amazing. In fact, by the time this video is released, I will be close to being done with it. It's a collection of essays written by members of the scientific community in various disciplines, a whole wide range of disciplines: geology, metallurgy, linguistics, social anthropology, economics, pure and applied sciences of of all stripes. And these researchers, these writers are examining the work of Tolkien through the prism of their field of study. So it's incredibly interesting. And the book is full of beautiful illustrations. It's going to be a collector's piece for sure. And that will be coming out next year, so 2021 at some point, I believe. And that'll be from Pegasus Books.
Tina Kover, thank you so much.
Thank you.